Hey, this is Matt O'Leary, and this is Albums at a Glance for June 2017, where I give my thoughts on a number of new releases from the past month, usually a little better known albums, a little better circulated, at least within the alternative music world. And this summer has been just crazy so far. I was gone for the first half of June in Scandinavia, and then when I came back, I feel like I had so many new releases to catch up on, so I was just listening and embracing new music. The summer has just boomed as far as that goes, and I feel like that's pretty typical, but I have about 8 or 9 here that are especially relevant, so let's get it going. First up is a Brazilian psych rock band, Boogarins. I actually saw these guys live open up for one of my favorite bands, Dungen, from Sweden last year. And this is a surprise album. It's all in Portuguese. It's called Levem a Morte. I really enjoyed the dense but cloudy sounds of their first album from 2015 called Manual. And this new one's been described as trying to confront the infinite superficiality of our days. It's really a search for truth in the midst of some absolutely absurd times, which I can appreciate, although I have no clue what they're saying on these songs. Many of the tracks here revolve around repetitive bass lines and these high, non-structured, lilting vocals. And everything's filtered through this kind of phaser effect, which almost makes it sound like you're walking into a club or into a venue and then kind of slowly coming out. The sound's being muffled and then opened up and then muffled again. Seeing these guys live, I really enjoyed the jazzy guitar sounds. I feel like it was mostly just this psychedelic blanket of noise, and then every once in a while the guitars would sort of pop out of the mix in a really interesting way. And those are the moments with that jazz guitar kind of being focused on that I really end up enjoying most on this album. Songs like Pluto Nocturna. And I ended up really liking the experimental electronics the band adds here and there, like on the title tracks or the second to last track. I feel like psych rock in general could really benefit from going in this direction with some experimental electronic sampling being thrown in or tossed in here and there. Next up is a band that kind of ironically ended up with a second album called Capacity that's far better than their debut album called Masterpiece. The second album, Capacity, is by the Brooklyn band Big Thief, and I feel like it totally just lacks any pretension. They really just strike gold with a pretty meat and potatoes approach. This is just indie rock. I feel like that sums it up pretty well. But that mysterious and incalculable ingredient of good songwriting is here in abundance. Fingerpick guitars really make the song Great White Shark. These soft, wistful layers pile up on top of each other into this intricate web of loveliness. Haley's another track where the guitar just absolutely sparkles. There's so many little subtle details that reveal themselves over time into this just breathtaking progression. So many guitar tones and little key flourishes. Probably my song of the year so far. But there is a lot of melancholy, a lot of tragedy on this album as well. The lead woman, Adrienne Lenker, tells about a childhood treehouse accident in one song, and there's another song called Shark Smile that's all about this fatal car crash. This is just one of those albums that drew me in instantly and then has just got better and better over time. It's tender and anguished at times, but also really sturdy and fully realized. This one's going to be hard to beat. We had a fascinating collaborative album come out this June called Planetarium by Bryce Dessner of The National and Nico Muhly, who I'm a little less familiar with, and then Sufjan Stevens. Suf. When I think of the universe, when I think of space, I think of mysterious wonder. I think of awe-inspiring majesty. This album does not convey that sense of wonder at all. Instead, what we got is a collection of pretty drab, pretty insipid electronic lulls. There are times in Sufjan's discography where I feel like he comes off as completely sincere, like Seven Swans, like Carrion Lull, which was my album of the year for 2015. I really like that mellow, somber side of him. But then there are albums like Age of Odds and Illinois where I'm consistently annoyed with his forced quirkiness or just weird for the sake of being weird approach. For me, songs like Venus, Mars, and Earth are really the latter. Whereas auto-tune high notes and kitschy electronics undermine any sense of genuine humility in the presence of the grandeur of space. For some reason, Sufjan's experimental side's always been a huge turnoff for me, and I know that's a pretty shallow, a pretty subjective complaint for an album that obviously took a lot of time, a lot of effort to work on. But if I'm being honest, it's distracting. Given my penchant for prog bands like Porcupine Tree and Opeth and Riverside, you'd think I would have heard of the UK band Anathema by now. Sadly, I have not, and this new album, The Optimist, is my first exposure. I was a little bummed there wasn't more material like the opening track Leaving It Behind on this album with its industrial underpinning and these impassioned minor guitar lines. This was the perfect opener for me. The vocalist sounds a lot like Haken's Ross Jennings. It's got a pretty traditional pop structure to it, but I really like that, and then they never returned to it later on the album, although the song San Francisco does replay the chord progression. I just wish the rest of the album was as visceral, as immediate as that track. But it does just keep growing and growing on me, and apparently this connects thematically to an older album called A Fine Day to Exit. So I'm looking forward to going back and exploring the band's past and getting some more context for this one, but The Optimist did do enough to spark my interest. Next up is a quintessential indie folk band, and after 6 years, it's Robin Pecknold's Fleet Foxes with Crack Up. The obvious observation is this much darker, much less immediate than either the debut or Helplessness Blues. That might turn the NPR crowd away, but for anyone who's in this for a deep, meaningful listening experience, they're in for something awesome. What I love about Fleet Foxes is they're keeping the album format as the art piece. You know, it's not just an unrelated random collection of songs, but it's got vision, it's got cohesion, you know, it's got something to say. I was pretty confused by all these low warbling vocal parts on the album, but after I listened, you know, several times, they started to make sense as this more self-conscious and more cracked up voice from Robin, and as a sharp contrast from the heavy strumming sections. Musically, the album's filled with these stunning contrasts, like on the song Cassius, where it sounds like we're going underwater and you get these shimmering guitars, and then we go and rise up above the water again. Or on the song Merrick Stoppa, where we shift from these airy, reverb-laden sections to this crisp jazz rock. I still haven't quite cracked this album as far as themes and narrative goes. I recognize some of the references, but it's going to take some time to really wrap my head around it. From the first listen, though, it was so dense and so detailed, I knew it was going to be good. It's definitely going to end up on a lot of end-of-the-year lists. Probably the most relevant psych rock band right now, it's of course King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard with their second of possibly 5 albums from the year. It's called Murder of the Universe. This one reminds me of their second album, so going way back, it's called Eyes Like the Sky or Eyes of the Sky or something like that. I think it's Eyes Like the Sky, but it's driven by the spoken word narrative, very similar to that album. I don't think it's quite as interesting of a story this time around, though. This one's filled with dystopian This one's filled with dystopian and sometimes revolting imagery of larval beds and bleeding skies and doom chants and just a pinch of vomit, you know, to top it off. This corny monster movie-esque take on the apocalypse really fits the band's style pretty well, but honestly I think it's a bit of overkill. The story is really not grabbing me, and honestly I'm not really into King Gizzard for some detailed storyline. There's a ton of crossover in sound between this one and Nonagon Infinity. I think it's cool they have so many musical motifs to draw on, but it feels a little too similar to me. That being said, you know, the typical energy and those repeating minor melodies, all still there. The band Scale of Summit put out another really solid album for any fans of instrumental progressive metal. And of all the bands of this ilk, I feel like Scale of Summit's sound is probably the easiest on the ears. The albums are always performed and mixed so cleanly that even the hardest drumming comes off a little like a drum machine. Take the song Witch House, for example, maybe the heaviest song amongst all the tracks here, but on record, you know, these are far from devastating sounds. I actually played the album for my wife at home, and usually she gets really just overwhelmed and overstimulated by this kind of music in general, but not so much on this one. It's not going to smash your face or cause buildings to crumble under its gargantuan weight, but I can appreciate their mastery of this process. They've been putting out an album every 2 years since 2007, and they're always so polished. They're always so beautiful. Last but not least, we got the comeback from British band Ride called Weather Diaries. You'll walk away from the first listen remembering the crisp production and the shoegazy guitars, but eventually the subtleties will reveal themselves. I love the grunginess of the David Foster Wallace referencing track Lateral Alice, or the hazy swells of the track Home is a Feeling. This is one of those albums that reminds me of what a well-constructed rock record is supposed to sound like. There's great balance between the hook-heavy tracks like Charm Assault and the more spaced out tracks like White Sand. There's both the instant and the delayed gratification. Great comeback album. Beyond those that I mentioned, there are also Kevin Morby and Phoenix albums that came out this past month, and I was pretty underwhelmed. Didn't really have a lot to say about either of them. I also reviewed the new Chan album, Homie, so if you haven't checked that out, I'll link it in the description box below. Otherwise, I think that's it. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon in a new review of the new album Boo Boo by Toro y Moi.